Hello, and welcome to the Mobile User Acquisition Show, a podcast to help you unlock tremendous growth for your app. My name is Shamant Rao. I'm the CEO of the boutique growth marketing firm Rocket HQ and host of the podcast Mobile User Acquisition Show. In each episode, we feature experts in the field of mobile growth and discuss strategies, tips, and pointers from the leading edge of mobile growth marketing. By the end of each episode, you will have gained actionable and tactical insights that will help you make more informed decisions in your own work around growth. The Mobile User Acquisition Show is produced by Meryl Vincent, Content Marketing Manager at Rocket HQ.
Our guest today is Brian Balfour, and today's episode is a rebroadcast from our older podcast, How Things Grow. Brian is seen as one of the most influential people in growth and product today. While Brian was the VP of growth at HubSpot, he was overseeing and systematizing some tremendous growth that was driven, astonishingly, by content. It was during this time that Brian started writing his very popular blog and also started what was then a side project called Silicon Valley Business Review, which was at the time an 8-week lecture series that he hosted along with Andrew Chen. The Silicon Valley Business Review subsequently grew into Reforge, which is now a definitive source of education around growth and product for experienced folks. In today's conversation, Brian not only talks about his own experiences and growth, but also dives into how Reforge is changing education and on product growth and all tech-related areas. Brian explains how he applies growth frameworks and loops to Reforge, and it's quite fascinating to listen to his breakdown of how he thinks about growth frameworks for a unique education business like Reforge. This interview was recorded when Reforge had 4 courses. Today, of course, they have many, many more, and it's a fascinating peek into the very early days of a very unique business. Brian, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, Brian. Brian, you've worked with an enormous number of companies and advised them on growth. You've helped so many companies grow. I would like to start by asking you about a company that I wasn't expecting to see in your roster of engagements, because it's so unlike most of the other tech companies that you've worked with. And this is Blue Bottle Coffee. And you said, and correct me if I'm wrong, you said that working with them made you a coffee snob. But other than that, what was the kind of work that you did with Blue Bottle, and how did your work in tech inform your work with a company that was so different from everything else you've done?
Yeah, I guess I should say it turned me into a coffee enthusiast rather than a snob, but it definitely, that's not what my wife says. It was a pretty cool experience, but you're right, it was a little bit different than some of the other companies that I've been involved with, and that's actually exactly why I took the gig on. So I originally met the Blue Bottle team through Andy Johns, who was also kind of in the growth community, and I started talking with that team, and I just really liked the team, and they were working on they had two sides of the business. They had, of course, their shops, their coffee shops. They also had their digital business as well, where they had both an e-commerce store as well as a subscription product. And, coffee is just a massive market, and they felt like there was a huge growing segment of the market around like craft coffee and kind of higher end coffee, and trying to figure out how to kind of expand that footprint, not just physically, but digitally as well. And so so worked on their digital side, their subscription product, their e-commerce product. They were bought by Nestle for somewhere close to $800 million or something for like a year, maybe a little longer. But it was definitely a different experience, a different set of challenges in the sense that, software was enabling the digital side of the business, still applying a lot of the same growth frameworks and stuff. But the model of growth itself for the digital side of that company was very different in terms of the levers that we pulled, as well as just kind of this really sort of interesting problem or integration about how do you kind of leverage this amazing physical in-store experience to also drive the digital side of the business and kind of vice versa. And was also a very specific challenge, not just from a growth perspective, but from a technology perspective as well, about how you integrate those two worlds.
Right.
And yeah, that's kind of how we came across it. And it was like a great experience. Unfortunately, not working with them any longer since kind of post acquisition, but it was definitely a fun experience.
Interesting. You've taken on very many challenges that look nothing like the earlier things that you have done. I'm excited to dive into so many of your experiences, Brian. And of course, to turn the clock back quite a bit from your work at Blue Bottle, you've said that the number one most valuable thing I've done in my career is to get an external unbiased coach. And you've also said that this is someone I worked for straight out of college. Can you speak to how your coach has impacted you? And you also said, at least at the point of time when you wrote whatever I read, you were still working with this exact same coach. So tell us about how this coach has impacted you and what had to happen to keep that relationship evolving over very many years.
So this person was actually my first manager straight out of college at ZoomInfo, where I was a product manager and kind of started my career. And I think we just formed like a really good relationship. And as I started my first venture back company, I had, kept in really great touch. He's an entrepreneur himself, and it just kind of like really built that relationship. And then I think a couple of years after I left ZoomInfo, I wanted to formalize it, structure around it a little bit. And that's kind of like how it all started and kept going since. And he's still a very meaningful advisor to my current company, Reforge, today. And
wow.
I think the way that it's impacted and the way that I kind of view it, and the reason why I use the words external unbiased coach, is that I think we just have a tendency to tell ourselves stories in our heads, either negative or positive, in the sense of like stories that aren't necessarily true. Right. And because just based on the way that like we're interpreting the world or perceiving things and putting a spin on it, and those stories can have like they don't necessarily serve us, right? They lead us astray from the actual truth. And I think that's actually the most important part, is like getting towards the truth. And so one of the most valuable things that this person has provided me is kind of just bringing me back down to earth, bringing me back to the truth, whether I'm telling myself like a really negative story about something like, as a founder, you'll go through so many times where you think like the company's just going to fall through the earth and it's all doom and gloom and stuff. He'll bring me back to, hey, well, actually there's all of these other positive things going on. This just seems like a problem we need to tackle head on, and so on and so forth. And so I think once again, just grounding back in that truth, I think really requires an external unbiased opinion, meaning like somebody who's going to look at it for what it is and not be afraid to tell you, like what they are seeing in terms of like the actual truth. And so I think this is really hard to get from other places, in the sense of like, if you have co-founders, they have their own sets of biases. Your team, they have your own. If you have a boss, they have a certain bias. Your wife or your friends or your significant other or whoever it is, right? Like they have their own, and they're all pulling them in the other direction. And so giving somebody the role in your life specifically of like, hey, your job is to help me really be grounded in the truth, is just, that's the most valuable thing that person has provided. And I think it's really hard to find, but if you can find it, it's worth it, and hold on to it.
Interesting. And you not only found this particular relationship, but you sustained it over very many years, even as you moved to very, very different kinds of roles. And I find that impressive that you sought this sort of feedback out. But much before your work at ZoomInfo, much before your work at Reforge, you actually founded a social network as a 19-year-old, well before Facebook and MySpace. What were some of the things you learned starting your first business? And did you also envision at the time that social networking could become as ubiquitous as it is today?
Yeah, I mean, my co-founder and I specifically, that the specific idea was to create a college-specific social network. And the hypothesis driven around that was that, just people like that are within the college environment are more tightly connected and have just like a lot more of the motivations around that. And yeah, at the time, the only things that were out there, I think, were like Insta and MySpace. And look, I mean, like we were one of like a lot of different stories, 30 to 40 different stories. There was actually quite a few of these that sort of had the same insight at the same time. And I think, look, like the big lesson was, it was just a lot around execution. Like we just did not execute well. We didn't have like the right co-founder mix that represented all of the essential skills that we needed to make that successful. So like we didn't necessarily have a technical co-founder. I became that person over time by just like teaching myself like how to code and stuff. But I think we didn't necessarily bring on the right mentors either at the time who really understood like the tech and the software space. We didn't move into the right environments to surround ourselves with those right supporting resources. And anyways, to be honest, I think right now, like looking back, I think they are all things that people would label as 101 mistakes, but you have to remember like this was 14 years ago, 15 years ago now. And the wealth of knowledge and resources that is now available for entrepreneurs and founders, like wasn't even close to what it was now. And in fact, like the fun story I like to tell is that I was at the University of Michigan, and at the time, to be honest, it was not the most entrepreneurial place for like technology and software. And I went to the dean of the entrepreneurship school. We told him about this business that we had, like this kind of business plan that we handed him. And this person handed back a book on the differences between brick and mortar and software businesses. And literally this book went through like, brick and mortar businesses have physical locations, software businesses don't, right? Like all these things. That was the type of help that was available at the time. And so look, I think a lot of the things that just, obviously Zuckerberg and team was an incredibly smart team, but they also just way out executed everybody. They understood network effects way earlier than anybody else. Just so many things. And one of the things that I tell my team at Reforge all the time, and I tell other entrepreneurs in my portfolio, is that in startups, the most important thing to think about is how do you build and maintain momentum? Because momentum is, once you lose momentum, it's 10x harder to regain it back. And momentum is the thing that attracts and retains the top talent. And that was the thing that Facebook did so well, is that they sequenced the momentum perfectly. And as a result, it's this snowball that just kind of accrues and grows and grows and grows. And so anyways, like those are kind of like, that's the high level of like how I think about that time. I wish I could go back and do it all over again. It would be amazing, but unfortunately.
Sure. But, that was also impressive because you were 19 at the time. And like you said, you had no resources at all. And in very many ways, it sounds like those are exactly the kinds of resources that you're building for entrepreneurs these days with Reforge. So people have that kind of access thanks to a lot of work you're doing now.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah.
Yeah. And, subsequently, you were at the forefront of another industry, another wave, this time with social gaming. And you founded a social gaming distribution company. For those of our listeners who haven't been in social gaming, can you tell us what a social gaming distribution company is and what exactly the product looked like?
Yeah, so I think at the time we started, the company's name was Viximo, and at the time, social gaming didn't even exist yet. We kind of started the company about a year before that really took off. But the insight was that there is this thing called virtual goods happening. And it was mostly happening over in Asia, kind of Korea and China being the two big places. And so I don't even remember how I originally learned about like virtual goods. I was like, I can't believe like people are paying for these things. And I dug into it and tried to understand it. And through that path and process, I feel like I was like, wow, like I think this virtual goods thing is going to be big in some way, shape, or form. We just don't know where and like how it's going to manifest. And so we kind of took this bet that we created this company that was going to be this virtual goods platform. We were going to be some type of platform and sell the tools to those to help enable this virtual goods model. And after about a year or so, like the Facebook platform was launched, and then the very early social games started to emerge. And it was very clear that social gaming was going to be the epicenter of like this business model. Mm-hmm. And so we pivoted the company into being the social gaming platform. And so at the time, for those who weren't around, like this whole ecosystem developed crazy fast, right? Like there were apps that went from like doing nothing to $1 million per day in revenue, like overnight. It was just absolute insanity. And, but the thing is that all these social game developers, there were so many of them at the time, were hyper concentrated on the Facebook platform in terms of their revenue. And they knew that was going to be a risk. And at the same time, there were actually all of these other social sites around the world that had pretty meaningful audiences, but nothing were close to Facebook. And so there was like 20 in Spain, there was StudiVZ in Germany, there was, of course, Bebo at the time, there was a bunch of these. And so what we did is we built this platform that aggregated all of those different sites and allowed a social game developer to kind of integrate once and get access to all of the distribution on those sites rather than, implementing and integrating to each one of them individually, which just ROI, the cost was just incredibly difficult. And so, we built a pretty decent business pretty fast once we pivoted to that, but then kind of the mobile shift came along and turned everything upside down again. And we started going through that transition, and about a year and a half into that is when kind of Tapjoy came along and acquired it. But it was a crazy roller coaster. And very volatile. Like the highs and the lows were very extreme during that time, probably the most extreme I've experienced in my career. But learned a ton too. That's kind of really where I started to build my chops around quantitative focused customer acquisition, the knowledge around viral loops and product driven growth loops. Like that's really where all like this growth thing really started. And as you see, like pretty much all of the, the leading growth people in the world right now stemmed from the social gaming world, and this is one of those reasons.
Certainly, and we've had quite a few of those on the podcast, and they've spoken quite a bit about those early days of social gaming. And as you said, it was certainly a crazy time, and you've certainly been at the forefront of the social gaming space from its very early days. And of course, you transitioned from that to something very different, which again is one of the things I find so impressive about you, is that you seem to have taken on challenges that look very little like the earlier ones that you've done, right? And you've written about your next venture that you decided to circumvent the tech averse and go straight to the end customer. That is how big disruption happens. They built a product for the students and marketed directly to the students in an industry where everything went through the professors' universities in a very corrupt way. So again, not only were you in a different space, but you also took a very unconventional approach to reaching the target market at the time. So what inspired you to basically seek a completely different space, but also a completely different approach from what would have been conventional?
Yeah, I mean, my second venture-backed company, this was Boundless Learning. Like, the thing that really attracted it to me was just initially the people. So, after Viximo, I kind of went off and did like a 3-month trip to Thailand, and I came back. And when I came back, two of my closest friends who were also entrepreneurs had started kind of peeling back the onion in terms of like the education space, specifically one of the most corrupt pieces of it, the textbook piece of it, and had built this hypothesis that, hey, like we could build this thing that would take the cost of producing textbooks down like 100x. So a textbook publisher would usually take about 2 years and $1 million to $2 to produce a textbook, which is absolute insanity. And we got that down to about less than a month, and somewhere between 10 and 20 grand in capital, depending on the topic, using things called open educational resources that the government had spent hundreds of millions of dollars funding over the years, but were buried in these like terrible databases of education institutions. And as a result, just like were not being used and everything. And so we just wanted to, it was very much like we took a bet that, we could build a process around that and then also market directly to the student. And I think those bets actually played off. We were able to do that, and Boundless ended up growing. They had, I can't even remember, like millions of students visiting the product a month. The challenge ended up being actually was where we got our hypothesis wrong was a little bit more around business model.
Yeah.
And we couldn't necessarily figure out that piece. And then unfortunately at that time, 3 of the largest textbook publishers banded together and sued us because they kind of saw the threat to their model.
Right.
And so while the lawsuit was baseless, the goal of it achieved its goal of kind of draining money out of the company. I put a bunch of pressures on it, and unfortunately, I can't talk about that in detail because of it. But yeah, it was just like it was really unfortunate because I think we had this amazing asset and that was incredibly valuable, and we just needed a little bit more time to like iterate on the business model and stuff. But that's how these things go. That's how these startups go. Is like you take these big bets, these big hypotheses. And work your ass off to try to prove them out as quickly as possible. And sometimes the bets are wrong, and sometimes the clock runs out on you. And that's kind of what happened in that case. And in similar, like, Reforge is very much in the professional education space now. And it's a different approach, but has some similarities in the sense that, a lot of the budgets and a lot of the decision making historically have been locked up in the hands of like HR execs and like, people at the management level. And as a result, the professional education companies end up building educational products that are very much about checking the boxes for those execs and not necessarily the end consumer. And so in a very similar way, like we are trying to build at Reforge, we are trying to build programs and products and material that is very much built for that individual end consumer first, and then work our way up the stack. And but there's a lot of things going on in professional education. Those budgets are being pushed to the hands of individuals, which I think is a great thing, and to managers who are much more closely connected with the problem. And that's gonna usher in a whole wave of like new professional education products as purchasing power shifts. So so it's interesting, like very different businesses, but similarities at the time.
Certainly, I can see what connects those dots. And certainly it's a very different paradigm that you guys are defining at Reforge, just compared to the traditional model of executive education on one hand, or like $20 ebooks on the other. So certainly I think Reforge has a very, very distinct niche. We'll certainly dive into the Reforge and the work you've done there, Brian. But I would imagine at some level the roots of Reforge, and we'll come to how it came about, but at some level I would imagine the roots of your work at Reforge were in your writing, because that's how very many people came to know about you and your work. I certainly did, right? So many other people that took Reforge programs really knew about you and Andrew through your writings. So, and you've also said that something that's very, very impactful for your career has been investing in your writing. So what inspired you to start writing, and what has been the impact of writing on your career?
Yeah, I think the very first thing that inspired me to write was like, I think coming out of college I wasn't a good writer at all. And by publishing a blog, I think it forced me to try to become a better writer. And that's how it inspired. But I think over time, look, for me, writing is thinking, in the sense that it is how I work through meaningful problems and then find a way to communicate those problems in a well-structured way. And so I think one of the things that is sorely lacking, to be honest, in a lot of professionals and stuff today is just this like ability to trust in your own problem solving skills and work through meaningful problems on your own. And part of it is like, Google, it's too easy to punch something into Google, but Google kind of really gives you the answer. Or like we're just running from meeting to meeting, just constantly reacting. And so then finally, when we have like 3 to 4 hour chunks of time, people almost kind of feel lost. Like, I don't even know what to do with this time. Like what things should I be working on and stuff like that. And so I think for me, it's just like writing is one of those things where I work through meaningful problems. So like for every blog post that I publish, there's probably about 10 to 20 that I have written but never published. And that's just me working through some thoughts of something I've observed or a problem I'm facing or a problem that one of my companies in our portfolio is facing or something to that nature. And I just find that that's how I think and that's how I end up learning. But the benefit of like doing some publishing is that it has certainly benefited me many times over in my career. And that's because writing is also a way to show off like your work and your knowledge. And that's also becoming incredibly important because you look at somebody's LinkedIn profile and it really doesn't tell you much about the person or like what the person is really capable of. Yes, there's signals around what types of companies they've worked for and like all that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, like all of my hiring at HubSpot and all the hiring at Reforge is 100% based on showing and understanding like the person's work. Right. And if they don't have a pre-existing portfolio, then we put them through exercises to see their work and I think that's just, designers and other roles are kind of useless, but this is becoming incredibly important for all roles and all functions is to find ways to show off a meaningful body of work that you have produced in your prior roles. And that's what writing has done for me.
Yeah, and certainly, as you said, there's nothing that lets you get to know somebody you're hiring better. Indeed, there's so much I learned about you for this interview, while researching for this interview, just by reading so much of your writing. So I can certainly see why that is the case. And Brian, speaking of writing, a lot of your work really became known very well while you were at HubSpot, where you headed up growth, where you were the VP of growth. And something I find very, very fascinating about HubSpot as a model that I hope you can speak to is this HubSpot's writing and content seems very, very ubiquitous. And you said for HubSpot, content deserves most of the credit for getting us to the IPO. And I find that very unusual and rare, especially when path-breaking tech is oftentimes credited with growth and innovation, not so much writing and articulation and content. But can you speak to why and how HubSpot's approach to content and writing was unique and effective, so much so that it got credit for taking them to the IPO?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of things that influenced the IPO, but this was one of the major ones. And while I wish I could take credit for it, it was really kind of Mike Volpe, who's the early CMO, and some of the early players like Megan Anderson and stuff that were the geniuses behind really establishing this model. And so I think there's two perspectives on it. There's what content for your company from a more of a softer side of things, like things you can't measure. And then there's just more of the underlying mechanics of it. And so I'll kind of go through both. I think the first is kind of what most people are used to, in the sense that what great content does as you kind of educate your audience and your user base is that it basically helps you build this brand and this reputation that is much larger than you actually are, like yourself as a product and a company. And what that's doing is it's providing the space for your product and your software to kind of grow into. So there were many people that would read HubSpot content that had no idea HubSpot sold software, but when they were in the buying cycle for buying marketing automation software, of course, one of the first places that they would go is HubSpot content, and then they would find out that HubSpot was also provided the software. And so, I think especially in the B2B software world, where the buying cycles can be infrequent, the question really is how do you stay top of mind in between those infrequent buying cycles so that when they do come around, you're one of the first choices. And so that's really kind of the role that content played. Now, the flip side of that, the underlying mechanics is, if you really understand the concept of self-reinforcing growth loops, what it did is that it was this massive self-reinforcing growth loop to the point that it's compounded so much that it's almost impossible for others to really compete and catch up with. And so it's become this massive defensible barrier, in the sense that as the company generated content and then published it out there, and then their audience would distribute it, what it also did is their audience would then write additional content linked back to HubSpot, which would improve SEO. And then like basically the next cycle of this loop that I'm describing got better and better with every single cycle. And so to the point that, HubSpot has the domain authority of like 98 or 99 or whatever it is, and they can publish any piece of content. It'll immediately rank in the first couple spots. And so it just builds this like massive compounding like machine over time that generated, when I was there, like, I don't like upwards of like 100,000 like leads per month. And it's just, that is just, it provided this distribution machine that is just freaking crazy. And so as a result, over time, that's what got to the IPO. And then now post IPO, the whole playbook that HubSpot has been running that I kind of went there to help start to establish was developing new product lines to continue to amplify this compounding like content loop that already existed or monetize it at even like higher levels. And so, it was an amazing playbook. Now the game is very different. The space is extremely crowded. Everybody's doing content. Once again, like I said, HubSpot was so far ahead and built that compounding machine so far ahead that it's just, it's just so hard to compete with.
Right. And I like the phrasing self-reinforcing growth loop. And was that premeditated and intended at the time, or did it just happen?
I don't really know, actually. I mean, the initial beginnings of it were certainly were a few years ahead of me. So I don't know if I ever had a conversation with Volpe or any of the early ones, if that's exactly how they thought about it.
Right.
I think, once I got there and started like codifying some of this stuff, a lot of this language kind of took hold and people started kind of viewing it in that perspective and doubling down on it. But in terms of inventing it at the point of inception, I actually have no idea. But the whole point, it was, if you do understand how the mechanics are, or if you are able to really break down like what's working and why it's working and understanding the engine, then you can tune the engine. You can, it's just like a mechanic. Like I know nothing about cars. And so I have no way of anticipating when my car is going to break down and when it does break down, how to fix it. But to a mechanic, they are able to anticipate those things. And when things do happen, they do know how to fix it because they understand that engine at a super deep level. And so that's, in terms of a role of growth, that is your purpose, is to understand and define that engine.
Right. No, I think that analogy makes complete sense. And when you speak of codifying that knowledge, that understanding of the mechanics, one of the first times you formally codified it, you certainly did quite a bit in your writings on your blog, but apart from that, one of the first times you codified a lot of that was in 2015, when you started what was then known as the Silicon Valley Business Review, which was what was described as an 8-week lecture series on growth. What inspired this initiative at the time?
Yeah, so I think while I was at HubSpot, our team grew incredibly fast, and I just ended up sitting in these one-on-ones on a weekly basis. And the team would just be asking me about professional development, like what they could be doing, and then I would spend hours researching what to recommend them, and I just kept coming up empty-handed. Either things were to like intro and entry level, so helping people, designed to help people get jobs, which is great, but just wasn't my team and like what they were looking for. There's certainly things out there, from traditional MBA schools, but they tend to be so high level and so disconnected that it's really hard for somebody to apply. And that's because, their customer could come from, finance to tech to management consulting. And so like they're trying to serve all of those audiences. And as a result, just really general. And then where it was just like, wasn't very credible. And so I decided, hey, I was going to create this course on the side and kind of write down everything that I felt like I had learned over the past 10 years. And then I had known Andrew Chen, who at the time was working on growth at Uber. And he was thinking about the same thing and had actually run a very small earlier test of like SVBR. And so we decided just to combine forces. We were like, hey, like, 2 times the knowledge, half the effort, and half the work. And then we decided, I think fall 2015 was when we did like the full SPPR. And I mean, look, like everybody talks about you should always be launching with an embarrassing prototype. I mean, this was an embarrassing prototype. Like every time I meet somebody that was in that first cohort, I apologize. And if you're listening and you're part of that cohort, I apologize, because that was an embarrassing prototype compared to what we have today. But despite that, it just did way better than expected. Like we had a couple thousand applications, and so it was clear that there was a demand and a hunger for it. And then despite its minimum viableness of the whole thing, people still had really good feedback to say about it, and then the problems that other ways to improve were incredibly addressable. And so I don't know, like at the time, it was a really hard decision to leave HubSpot. We had done some amazing things were still going on, but I decided to leave and see kind of what it was. We renamed it to Reforge, and I think what we really hit on and what we found is just that what we're ultimately at the end of the day is like we're building this engine to unlock the knowledge of the world's top practitioners. And so while the quantity of information and knowledge has certainly increased out there because of like Google and like content marketing, the amount of knowledge that is accruing to a small group of people around these frontier topics, these new topics that are emerging that are high in demand but like low in supply and all that kind of stuff. That stuff is continually just being trapped in these minds of these small group of people. And so like we're building an engine around them, those that are like really pushing the frontier of their practice and unlocking the strategies and the systems that they use so that others have access to it. You don't have to be as lucky. You don't have to be like one of the lucky few to work directly for them to actually have access to this stuff. And so, we built some amazing programs around people like Casey Winters, who's now the Chief Product Officer at Eventbrite, and Sean Klaus, who just joined MuleSoft as the SVP of product there. We're working with Elena Verna, who built the SurveyMonkey team from scratch on a new program. Just an amazing group of people, and we're going to continue to sort of expand that. But that's kind of how it all came about.
Wow. Yeah. And first of all, I would say if you had 1,000 applicants, many of whom gave great feedback, that's probably not an embarrassing product, but I can imagine it is still a V1 compared to where it is today. And I certainly see what you mean about unlocking the expertise that is in the heads of some of the leading practitioners. When she was on this podcast, and she basically said that was one of her motivations these days, and that's essentially why she engages with Reforge. So I can absolutely see the mission that was driving you at the time, and that impelled you to start the program. There were like 1,000 applicants. Did you envision at the time when you had the V1 that this could be the full-fledged business that it is today with tens of employees and thousands of alumni?
I mean, yes and no. I mean, obviously we had a hypothesis, and we actually wrote them all. I wrote all of these hypotheses down. I still have like the 2015 Evernote file from this of like, here's all our hypotheses about audience and differentiation and product, market, and like all of these separate things that we think, if true, will make a really big business. Now, did we have extremely high confidence that all of those things were true? Hell no, right? Like that is just like that's not how things begin. And so the job is like you have all of these hypotheses, and then the job is like you go out and do things to either prove hypotheses correct or wrong. And if they're wrong, then you kind of adjust and adapt. And so I think for the first 2.5, 3 years, like we were really working through these hypotheses about like whether or not we had like really strong confidence of them and true, and just we addressed them. We didn't address them all at once. It was, one after another. Like first thing was like, okay, can we take this MVP if we put a little bit more time into it, flesh it out a little bit more, get NPS scores up, and we did that. Like I think NPS scores from the MVP went from 20 to like 72 on the next version, and we were like, oh, okay, interesting. And we were like, all right, well, like, can we run this thing again, or was this just like a one-time thing that only a certain number of people were interested in? That worked. And then we were like, okay, well, can we create a second one? And will that have as much demand for it? And we did that, and that worked. And we were like, okay, well, what if we do a third one, but take a totally different approach to it? And then that thing worked, right? And so it's just, and along the way, we're just proving out all sorts of different hypotheses. And I think, late last year, we kind of came around and we looked at this and we were like, you know what? We think we're building something really big here. We feel really confident from all the information that we've gathered. And, early this year, we started to step on the gas a little bit, really build the team, really expanding the programs that we're building, expanding the software product, all sorts of things. So, but that's how we approach that. That's systematically how we approached it.
Yeah, much like you approached growth for all of the products you worked on, even though everything else was consumer tech products, and you brought the same rigor, the same analysis to how you grew Reforge, right?
Yeah, I think the most underutilized tool in the world right now is the scientific method. Seriously, that thing has been built, was built, I don't even know when, defined like hundreds of years ago, and there's a reason that it was defined and has been used for so long, and that's because it's an incredibly valuable tool when you're going into kind of the unknown and trying to solve and prove different problems.
Right. You saw that this Reforge could become something very big, something very substantial. Yet, I would say there are elements of Reforge's model and how you guys work that could be considered antithetical to scale. For instance, the live meetups are an important part. There's hours of preparation and recording that goes into what looks very much like a service business, right? Like an educational business. So how do you think about a lot of these things that some might consider antithetical to scale? And how do you sort of think about those in the scheme of things of Reforge and the size of the impact it could have?
Yeah, I mean, we very much view it it's an education company, not a consulting company. So we very much talk about how we give and teach the tools for others to solve their own problems. We are not solving the problems for them. That it's a very clear difference. And we very much view ourselves as a product company, not a service company, in the sense that we view every program, it's a product, and including not just like the material that we teach, but the formatting that we wrap around it. So how we think about scale, I can't necessarily talk about it in a ton of detail because it's kind of the part of the grand master plan that we're still working on releasing. But our current format is basically one product format. And there's a bunch of different ways that you can package this and like what we're doing that serves different use cases for different audiences and different levels of scale. And they all kind of like fit together in a certain set of pieces. And so we are very much playing the long game, though, in the sense that I think there are professional education companies out there that went for scale incredibly quickly. And as a result, it's coming to bite them back in the ass in the sense that they just like, they created this quote unquote credential and then just like tried to sell as many of those credentials as possible to as many people as possible. And the problem and the challenge with that is that if the thing that you are selling is a credential, then that credential's inherent value is based over time on the quality of people that have that credential, whether you can help produce that person or more like HBS, which is like they just do all the filtering at the top of the funnel to build that value. And as a result, those credentials start to over time take a meaningless form and really starts to like hurt the business. And we are not trying to build a company where we're trying to build a credential. We could have a whole other hour podcast on like all of the things that are wrong with credentials and why they are meaningless in today's world. But I think to build a really meaningful company in education is that you have to play a slightly longer game. It might be slightly slower growth than we're used to of like these B2C social networks and stuff. But the space is monstrous when you consider one MBA school, HBS, brings in about 700 million in revenue per year, not including donations, right? That's one school, right? And like, it is absolute insanity how big the space is. And so the main way we think about scale over time is not just through more programs and a broader audience, but we will certainly have new formats, new program formats that serve different use cases for different audiences at different levels of scale.
Right. And I've certainly seen you guys go from 1 program to 4, if I remember correctly at this point. So certainly there's ways that you guys have expanded just in the last couple of years. And I'm excited to see what comes next, Brian. Part of something that I found interesting, and I know you briefly alluded to this, was that, you said, look, the value of a lot of credentials really goes down because they want to market to everybody and anyone at all. And I do find it interesting that I know people who applied for Reforge and didn't get in. So why not be revenue maximizing?
I think a lot of people actually don't understand how we accept and select people. I think people are used to kind of the old world where you're accepted into these things based on some level of like prestige or something like that. And that is actually not what we do at all. What we really think about is what we call fit, meaning is this person applying going to be able to get an immense amount of value out of this program based on like their role, their stage in their career, the type of company and product that they're working on, and some other the problems that they're facing and some other factors. And we match that based on our in-depth in knowledge about what we are teaching, who we designed the program for, and like all of these other things, all of these other factors. And we're trying to always match those. At a top level, we were trying to match those 2 elements. On a second level, because our current program format does have a live format and there is peer-to-peer interaction, you have to think about your product experience. That's part of the product experience, and a key part of making that part of the experience compelling is that people are meeting others that are facing similar problems and similar challenges and similar types of roles to them. And so, if we, part of the issue is like, if you get a early stage founder in the same group as a senior product manager at Facebook, right? Like those 2 people are facing very different problems, very different challenges and all that kind of stuff. And so we have to constrain it to really thinking about how do we built this product specifically for a certain type of person. And what we're doing is we're trying to match that with the people applying. And I think a lot of products actually don't do this well enough, is like they build a product specifically for a certain target audience, and then they just launch it to the masses. And that really creates a lot of issues in the sense that it's really hard to understand like what's working and like what's not working. And it creates this really bad negative word of mouth cycle, because all of a sudden you have all these people coming into the product that you didn't build it for, who see this product and they're like, what the hell is this thing? Like this thing sucks, right? And they don't really understand that, hey, like they might not have been the exact target audience. And so I wrote a whole blog post about that, about product launches and feature launches in that sense. But that's kind of how we think about it, in the sense that we're really not only trying to like optimize for, how helpful and how impactful this thing is going to be for people, but we're trying to optimize the experience and trying to build like this community at the same time. And we'll slowly continue to expand and expand and expand. But this kind of goes back to our point earlier of like, we could, I don't know, maybe this year generate 3x the amount of revenue that we're generating, and that might, if we're optimizing for short-term revenue, that is definitely probably the right thing to do. But we're trying to very much think about this on a mid to long-term basis and how we maximize that.
Certainly. And it absolutely does take courage to say no to short-term revenue. Brian, I know you spoke about self-reinforcing growth loops, and that's certainly a concept that Reforge has popularized, and certainly within the growth community. I'm curious how you think about that concept as applicable to Reforge as a business.
So I think the thing that there are all sorts of different types of businesses, but the types of business that we specifically think about and address in Reforge are the ones that are in or are trying to be in basically like the top 1% of businesses of all time, right? Like the Facebooks and the Spotifys and the LinkedIns and the HubSpots and all that kind of stuff of the world. And the dynamics to grow those types of businesses are, different than if you live in a different category. And that's not necessarily, it's not a good or a bad thing. It's just the thing that we specifically address at the moment. And one of the things that separates this category of companies from everybody else is that they are built on a system of compounding loops. And so we talk about this and how it applies in both our growth series program as well as our strategy program in depth. And there's about 20 different types of growth loops out there that we go through. Each of them have different kind of execution factors, pros and cons, and they fit together in different ways and all that kind of stuff. For Reforge itself, we basically, obviously, if you look at the early versions of the business, we started off with a content loop of like my blog and Andrew's blog. And that's really kind of what drove applications. Over time, what we're in the midst of the shift of is a lot more to like a set of viral loops, in the sense that we have all of these programs in this content machine going that brings people in and re-engages them. But we very much build our content for how do we make this as actionable as possible. Right. And part of it being actionable is going back and implementing it to your company. And of course, one of the things that you need to do when you go back and implement it in your company is that you have to align the team around it. And so we've started to enable these features that participants can bring their colleagues into that experience and kind of align around a concept or learning or our particular strategy. And we're kind of in the midst of this shift. And there's a set of smaller loops that we use in terms of application. You can invite colleagues. It's kind of a viral amplification of it. We also use a manager loop, a viral loop, in the sense that you can get somebody to vouch for you in the application process. That also ends up being a viral loop. But the core of it is really centered around the content and the program experience of, if we make this thing super actionable, you are going to want to pull other people's into this experience to like accomplish something within your company and your product. And so there is a set of features that are enabling a bunch of those viral loops like over time. And so, look, the strategy was very specifically chosen, tying it back to our earlier conversation about how content marketing is so crowded. We weighed that. We were like, well, what if we should just play the content marketing game? And there was a number of reasons I concluded that I was like, I don't think this is the right long-term strategy to invest in. But one of those reasons was just we could produce something, and the number of other players out there that have an immense amount of more domain authority than us are just going to go out. They're going to copy it. They're going to rank higher. They're going to push us out, right? And so like we just started to move in a different direction on that.
Wow, that's fascinating. And hearing you talk about that, it's almost like listening to you break down a social game, basically, a lot of the referral mechanics that you just described. And I think that's absolutely fascinating. Brian, we could just keep going on, and there's so many more topics that I would love to ask you, but I do want to be respectful of your time. This has been incredibly fascinating, exploring very, very many facets of your work, and also just understanding to some extent what the grand plan for Reforge could look like, and really, really appreciating the kind of impact Reforge has been having. I'm an alumni of Reforge, and it's something that's very, very deeply impacted me. So definitely something I'm very, very thankful to you for. As we start to wrap up, can you tell our listeners how they can find out more about you and about Reforge?
Yeah, definitely. So you can go to reforge.com. All of our programs are listed there. We have some email lists there to be notified when a new cohort comes around. You can also find me at my personal website, brianbalfour.com. And my Twitter handle is bbalfour. However, I'm on a social media diet this year, so I'm not super active there. So Reforge or my website are definitely the more active places at the moment.
Fabulous. And we're going to link to all those places in the show notes. For now, thank you so much, Brian, for appearing on How Things Grow.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Hey guys, this is Shamant again. Before you go, I have a small but very important favor to ask. If you get any pleasure or inspiration from this episode, could you please leave a review on your favorite podcasting platform, be it iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcast fix. This podcast is very much a labor of love. It makes no money, and each episode takes many, many hours to put together. When you leave a rating or write a review, it not only means a great deal of encouragement to me, but it also supports getting the word out about how things grow. Thank you again for listening, and I look forward to seeing you with the next episode. Thank you. For more tips, pointers, and strategies from the leading edge of mobile user acquisition, subscribe to our YouTube channel right here, or check out our blog, rocketship.hq.com/blog.